There is a terrifying reality in this life, that you can invite someone into your world, sit across from them at a dinner table, and have absolutely no concept of what is truly going on inside their mind. You might think you are looking at a normal person, but in reality, you have no idea what they are capable of. This happened about 3 years ago, during the final bitter cold days of autumn. My wife, Sarah, and I decided to rent a secluded cabin tucked away near an isolated lake in the Pacific Northwest. We both worked highly stressful corporate jobs, and we desperately needed a few days to completely disconnect from the world. Our close friend, Mark, was going through a terrible time. He had just finalized a messy, exhausting divorce, and he was feeling incredibly lonely. Sarah and I thought it would be a great idea to invite him along to help take his mind off things. The cabin we rented was a large A-frame building, surrounded by dense, dark pine trees, and located miles away from the nearest town. It was the perfect place to drink some beers, sit by a fire, and just exist in peace. About 3 days before the trip, Mark called me. He sounded hesitant. He asked if it would be okay if he brought a +1. He explained that he had recently matched with a woman on a dating app a few weeks prior, and things were going really well. Her name was Chloe. Honestly, Sarah and I were not thrilled. The whole point of the trip was to have a private, comfortable space to support our friend. Bringing a total stranger into a remote, confined cabin felt forced and like a recipe for awkwardness. But Mark sounded so excited, and we didn't want to ruin his good mood. I reluctantly agreed, secretly hoping that Chloe would just be easygoing and normal. We all met at the cabin on a Friday evening. Mark and Chloe pulled into the dirt driveway just a few minutes after we did. When I first saw Chloe, she looked completely ordinary. She was polite, maybe a little quiet, but there was nothing about her appearance or initial behavior that set off any alarms. However, within the first hour of being inside the house, a very strange atmosphere settled over the room. Normally, when you arrive at a vacation rental, you check out the bedrooms, look at the view, and start unpacking. Chloe did the exact opposite. She immediately began walking around the cabin, inspecting it in a way that felt calculating. She walked along the walls, tapping the glass of the windows. She meticulously checked the latches on both the front and back doors. At one point, she turned to me and with a completely flat voice asked how far away the nearest neighbors were, and if the police ever patrolled this far out. I just laughed it off, assuming she listened to too many true crime podcasts and was feeling paranoid about being in the middle of the woods. I told her we were completely isolated and that cell service was practically non-existent. She didn't say anything back. She just nodded slowly, her eyes staring out into the dark tree line. The first real red flag happened during dinner. Sarah was cooking, and she asked Chloe to help dice some onions. Chloe agreed and pulled a large chef's knife from the wooden block on the counter. I was sitting at the kitchen island, having a beer and talking to Mark. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed that Chloe had stopped moving. I looked over at her. She was standing perfectly still in front of the cutting board. Her hand was gripping the handle of the knife so tightly that her knuckles were white. But she wasn't chopping anything. Her eyes were wide open, just staring blankly at the empty kitchen wall. It was like her brain had simply shut off. She stood frozen in that exact position for at least a full minute. The silence in the kitchen became incredibly heavy. Sarah noticed it too. She nervously asked, "Hey Chloe, is everything all right?" Chloe blinked, snapping out of whatever trance she was in. She set the knife down on the counter with a loud clack. She let out a dry, unnatural laugh and mumbled that she was just tired from the long drive. Mark quickly jumped in to change the subject, but Sarah and I exchanged a very uneasy look. That wasn't just zoning out. She looked like she was rehearsing something terrible in her head. That night, things escalated from awkward to deeply horrifying. Around 2 a.m., I woke up with a dry throat. I quietly got out of bed, trying not to wake Sarah, and walked out into the dark hallway to get some water from the kitchen. The cabin was dead silent, except for the wind hitting the windows. As I stepped into the main living room, my blood ran cold. By the pale moonlight shining through the front windows, I saw a dark figure standing right by the front door. It was Chloe. She was standing motionless, facing the door, with her back to me. I held my breath and watched. She slowly reached out, grabbed the deadbolt lock, and quietly turned it until it clicked open. Then, she turned it back to lock it. She did it again. Unlock, lock, unlock, lock. It was a slow, patient, methodical movement. She wasn't sleepwalking. She was practicing the mechanism, making sure she knew how to open that door without making a single sound. My heart was pounding in my chest. I cleared my throat and softly said her name, Chloe. She stopped moving instantly. Her hand remained resting on the deadbolt. She didn't jump. She didn't gasp. She just slowly turned her head to look over her shoulder at me. Her face was completely hidden in the shadows. We stood there in the dark for what felt like an eternity. She didn't offer an excuse. She didn't say a single word. She just turned her body away from the door, walked past me with stiff, heavy steps, and went straight back into the guest bedroom she was sharing with Mark. I stood in the dark kitchen, shaking. I checked the door to make sure it was locked and went back to bed. I didn't sleep a single minute for the rest of the night. The next morning, the tension in the cabin was suffocating. Chloe acted completely normal, pouring coffee and smiling, as if she hadn't been testing the locks in the pitch black a few hours ago. I pulled Sarah aside and whispered what I had seen. She was terrified. We agreed. We needed to make up an excuse and leave immediately. But before we could figure out a plan, Mark walked out of the guest room. He looked sick. His face was pale white, and his hands were trembling. He walked straight up to me, grabbed my arm, pulled me into the bathroom, and locked the door. His eyes were wide with panic. He whispered that he couldn't find his car keys, so he had been looking around the bedroom. He saw Chloe's large duffel bag sitting on the floor. It was slightly unzipped, and he thought maybe his keys had fallen inside. When he pulled the zipper open, he didn't find any clothes. He didn't find makeup, or a toothbrush, or a hairbrush. Mark's voice broke as he told me what was inside. The bag was completely empty, except for a coil of thick nylon rope, a roll of heavy-duty duct tape, and a large, rusted claw hammer. There was nothing else in that bag. No clothes for a weekend getaway. Just items that looked like they belonged in the trunk of a serial killer. A wave of pure dread washed over me. My mind raced back to her, checking the windows, asking about the neighbors, testing the locks in the dark. She wasn't paranoid about the woods. She was evaluating the cabin to see how easily someone could scream for help. I told Mark to grab his jacket and that we were leaving right that second. We stepped out of the bathroom, and Sarah instantly knew something was very wrong. I looked at Sarah and told her to grab our bags. I turned to Chloe, who was sitting comfortably on the sofa. I kept my voice as steady as I could. I told her that we just got a call about a family emergency back home and that we had to leave immediately. Chloe slowly set her coffee mug down. The polite demeanor vanished. Her face hardened, and she looked up at me with an expression of pure, unblinking anger. "But we just got here," she said. Her voice was low and completely flat. "We have the whole weekend. No one else is coming." The way she said that last sentence made my skin crawl. Right then, Mark bolted out of the bedroom, holding his jacket. He didn't even look at her. He just grabbed his car keys from the kitchen counter and practically ran out the front door. Sarah and I were right behind him. As we threw our bags into my car, I looked back at the cabin. Chloe was standing on the front porch. She didn't ask for a ride. She didn't ask where we were going. She just stood there in the cold, staring at us with dead, empty eyes. We got into our cars and sped down the dirt road, leaving a cloud of dust behind us. We drove for an hour in absolute silence before finally pulling into a gas station. Mark was completely broken by the experience. He immediately blocked her number and deleted the dating app. We never found out what her actual plan was for that weekend. About a month later, Mark was still so disturbed by it that he did some digging. He reverse image searched the single picture she had used on her dating profile. It was a stolen photo from an obscure European clothing catalog. The phone number she had been using was an unregistered burner phone. Her name wasn't Chloe. We have absolutely no idea who she really was, or what she intended to do with that hammer and rope in the middle of nowhere. But I know one thing for certain. If Mark hadn't looked inside that duffel bag, none of us would have made it out of that cabin alive. There is a very specific type of silence that exists only in deep isolation. People often romanticize the idea of going off the grid, escaping the noise of the city, and just being alone with their thoughts. But what they don't realize is that when you remove all the background noise of civilization, your brain starts trying to fill in the blanks. Every creak of the floorboards sounds like a footstep. Every gust of wind sounds like a whisper. A few years ago, I was working as a freelance software developer. I had taken on a massive project with a very tight deadline, and I found myself getting completely distracted at my apartment in the city. I needed absolute focus. So, I went online and found a short-term rental property located deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It was a renovated farmhouse sitting at the very end of a 5-mile private dirt road. There were no neighbors, no streetlights, and absolutely no cell service. It was just me, a satellite internet connection, and endless miles of dense, dark forest. For the first 3 days, it was exactly what I needed. I was highly productive, completely undisturbed, and enjoying the serene environment. But on the 4th day, things started to feel slightly off. It was a Thursday afternoon. I had been staring at my computer screen for hours, so I decided to step outside and take a walk down the long dirt driveway to stretch my legs. The weather was overcast, casting a dull gray light over the trees. About a half-mile down the road, I noticed something that made me stop in my tracks. Tire tracks, fresh ones. They were pressed deeply into the damp soil, leading up toward the farmhouse, and then looping back around toward the main highway. I hadn't ordered any deliveries, and the property owner wasn't scheduled to drop by. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it was probably just someone who took a wrong turn, realized it was a dead end, and turned around. I forced myself to brush it off and walked back to the house, but the lingering feeling of being watched stayed with me for the rest of the day. That night, a severe thunderstorm rolled over the mountains. The rain was coming down in absolute sheets, hammering against the tin roof of the farmhouse. It was around midnight. I was sitting at the kitchen table, with only the glow of my laptop screen illuminating the room. The power had flickered a few times, so I was trying to wrap up my work before I lost all my unsaved progress. Suddenly, the bright, blinding light of the motion sensor floodlight outside the front porch clicked on. The light poured through the gaps in the window blinds, casting long, eerie shadows across the living room floor. My heart jumped into my throat. The property was surrounded by a tall perimeter fence, so large animals rarely wandered close enough to trigger that specific light. I sat completely frozen in my chair, listening over the deafening sound of the rain. I heard it, A heavy, deliberate knock at the front door. It wasn't frantic. It wasn't the desperate pounding of someone seeking shelter from the massive storm. It was 3 slow, rhythmic knocks. I slowly stood up, my legs feeling like lead. I walked over to the front door, trying not to make a single sound on the hardwood floor. The door was solid oak, but it had a small circular peephole right in the center. I leaned in, closed one eye, and looked out onto the brightly lit porch. Standing there, directly under the glaring floodlight, was a man. He didn't look like a lost hiker. He didn't look like a stranded driver. He was wearing a charcoal gray suit. He had on a white dress shirt, a dark tie, and leather shoes. He didn't have an umbrella, but he wasn't completely soaked either. His shoulders were damp, as if he had only been in the rain for a few seconds. Like he had just stepped out of a vehicle parked directly out of my line of sight. Nothing about this made any logical sense. I was miles deep in the mountains, in the middle of a severe storm, at midnight, and a man dressed for a business meeting was standing on my porch. I didn't open the door. Keeping the deadbolt securely locked, I leaned close to the wood and spoke loudly so he could hear me over the rain. "Who are you? What do you want?" The man didn't flinch. He didn't look around. He kept his eyes fixed dead center on the door, staring right at the peephole, as if he could see my eye on the other side. When he spoke, his voice sent a chill straight through my veins. It was perfectly calm. It was completely monotone, lacking any inflection, panic, or normal human emotion. "My vehicle has experienced a mechanical failure. I need to come inside and use your telephone. Bring, Zay." It sounded rehearsed. There was no urgency, no shivering from the freezing wind, no polite desperation. "I don't have a landline," I lied, keeping my voice as firm as possible. "And the cell service doesn't work out here. You need to go back to the highway." The man did not move a single muscle. He just stood there, his posture perfectly straight, his arms resting rigidly at his sides. There was an unnervingly long pause. The silence, stretching between us, felt suffocating. Then, he spoke again, still in that same, flat tone. "I am very cold. I need to come inside the house." "I am not letting you in," I yelled, my panic starting to bleed into my voice. "Get off the porch right now, or I am calling the police. I have a satellite connection, and I will call them." The man didn't react with anger. He didn't show a wide, unnatural smile. He did something much worse. His face remained completely blank, devoid of any expression whatsoever. He simply leaned forward until his face was only an inch away from the heavy wooden door. "Come on, Daniel. Just open the door already." My lungs completely seized up. I stopped breathing. He knew my name. This wasn't a random encounter. This wasn't a stranded motorist. This man in the suit had come up this mountain specifically for me. I backed away from the door in pure terror. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the largest knife I could find, and snatched my cell phone off the counter. The satellite Wi-Fi was incredibly slow because of the storm, but I finally managed to dial 911 through a web calling app. I was shaking so violently that I could barely explain to the dispatcher where I was. I told them a man was trying to break into my isolated rental and that he somehow knew my name. The dispatcher told me to lock myself in a secure room and stay on the line. I ran into the bathroom, locked the door, and sat on the floor in the dark, gripping the knife until my knuckles turned white. I sat there for over an hour, listening to the rain, terrified that at any second I would hear the sound of the front door splintering open. Finally, I saw the flashing red and blue lights reflecting against the bathroom window. I heard the crunch of heavy boots on the porch and a police officer shouting my name. When I finally opened the front door, the man in the suit was gone. 2 officers took my statement, while another searched the perimeter of the property with a flashlight. When the 3rd officer returned, his expression was grim. He asked me to step outside and follow him to my car, which was parked on the side of the house. I walked out into the cold rain. The officer shined his light onto my vehicle. All 4 of my tires had been completely deflated. They had been slashed open. But that wasn't the most horrifying part. The officer then shined his flashlight into the thick mud directly beneath my bedroom window. There, clearly visible in the mud, were dozens of footprints belonging to a pair of dress shoes. The prints were layered on top of each other, pacing back and forth. The officer looked at me and said that based on the tracks, the man hadn't just arrived when the motion light went off. He had been standing outside my bedroom window, watching me in the dark, for hours before he ever decided to knock on the front door. I never spent another night at that farmhouse. The police escorted me back to the city the very next morning. They investigated the property, but they never found the man, and they never found the car that left those tire tracks. I still work as a freelance developer, but I will never seek out isolation again. I now know the terrifying truth. Sometimes, when you think you are completely alone, you are actually just out of earshot from anyone who can help you. A lot of people think buying a foreclosed property is an easy way to make money. You watch a few videos online, you go to a county auction, and you think all it takes is some hard work and fresh paint. But the reality of buying a house sight unseen is that you have absolutely no idea what you are actually buying. You aren't just inheriting a building, you are inheriting whatever history was left behind. About 4 years ago, I decided to try my hand at real estate investing. I had saved up a decent amount of money and bought a foreclosed property on the outskirts of an aging suburb. It was a large 2-story house. The previous owner, an elderly man named Arthur, had passed away 3 years prior, and the property had been tied up in legal disputes ever since. It had been sitting completely vacant all that time. My plan was to spend a month doing the demolition and deep cleaning myself to save money before bringing in professional contractors. The yard was entirely overgrown, the paint was peeling, and the windows were covered in dirt, but structurally, the house was sound. I arrived on a Monday morning to begin the work. Because the power and water had just been turned back on, the house felt incredibly cold. The moment I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, I was hit by a wall of stale, heavy air. It smelled like dust and decay. The house was still filled with a lot of Arthur's old belongings. Heavy wooden furniture, stacks of newspapers, and boxes of junk were scattered across the first floor. I decided to start my work in the main living room. For the first 2 days, my routine was exactly the same. I would arrive at 8 in the morning, put on my respirator mask, turn my Bluetooth speaker up loudly, and spend the entire day hauling garbage bags out to a dumpster in the driveway. By Wednesday afternoon, I had completely cleared out the living room. The only things left were a few large pieces of antique furniture that were too heavy for me to move alone. To protect them from the dust while I ripped up the old carpet, I covered them with thick, heavy-duty plastic drop cloths. It was during that Wednesday afternoon that I started to notice small things that simply didn't make sense. I had brought a cooler filled with bottled water and sandwiches, which I kept in the kitchen. When I went to grab a bottle of water around noon, I noticed the cooler lid wasn't pushed down all the way. I brushed it off, thinking I was just tired, but then, later that day, I couldn't find my heavy-duty box cutter. I had been using it to slice sections of the carpet. I tore my tool bag apart looking for it, but I eventually gave up and just assumed I had accidentally thrown it into one of the garbage bags. When you spend too much time alone in a quiet place, Your mind naturally tries to rationalize things. I convinced myself that I was just being absent-minded from the physical exhaustion. Thursday is the day everything changed. I arrived at the house and decided it was time to inspect the second floor. The layout upstairs was a long, narrow hallway with 3 bedrooms branching off it. At the very end of the hallway, right in the ceiling, was a square wooden panel. It was the access hatch for the attic. As I walked down the upstairs hallway, a sudden, horrifying smell hit my face. It wasn't the smell of old dust or a dead mouse in the walls. This was a heavy, suffocating stench. It smelled like unwashed skin and rotting food. The smell was so strong it made my stomach turn, and it was heavily concentrated right beneath the attic hatch. The hatch didn't have a pull-down ladder. You had to push the wooden panel up and slide it to the side. I went downstairs, grabbed my aluminum stepladder and a flashlight, and carried them back up to the hallway. I set the ladder up directly under the hatch. The house was completely silent. I hadn't turned on my music yet that morning. I climbed the steps slowly, placed my hand flat against the wooden panel, and pushed it up. It slid away into the darkness. I poked my head up into the pitch-black attic and clicked on my flashlight. The beam of light cut through the thick dust. The attic was massive. I swept the light slowly from left to right, and then I stopped breathing. About 20 feet away from the hatch, tucked into the far corner of the attic, was a nest. It was a makeshift bed created out of filthy blankets, old couch cushions, and torn clothing. Surrounding the bed was a mountain of garbage. There were dozens of empty food wrappers, crumpled water bottles, and several plastic jugs filled with a dark yellow liquid. But the most terrifying detail wasn't the trash. I moved the beam of my flashlight slightly to the left, illuminating a small wooden crate next to the sleeping bag. Resting on top of the crate was a half-eaten sandwich in a clear plastic wrapper, and sitting right next to it was one of the water bottles from my cooler downstairs. It was completely empty. This wasn't the remnants of a squatter who had stayed here years ago. Someone had been living in this attic right now. Someone had been climbing down at night, eating my food, and walking around while I wasn't there. And then, pure logic kicked in, replacing my shock with absolute terror. I had been making a massive amount of noise all morning, hammering, dragging the ladder, walking heavily up the stairs. If someone was currently up here in the attic, they would have hidden the moment they heard me arrive. But the attic was completely empty. There was nowhere to hide up here. That meant whoever was living in this house was currently downstairs. I slowly lowered myself back down the ladder. I didn't slide the hatch closed. I just left it open. I needed to leave the house immediately. I didn't care about my tools. I didn't care about locking the doors. I just needed to get to my car. I crept down the main staircase, placing my feet carefully to avoid making the wood creak. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I had to walk through the main living room to get to the front door. I stepped into the living room, keeping my eyes locked on the front door. Everything was exactly as I had left it yesterday. The antique furniture was sitting in the center of the room, draped in the heavy plastic drop cloths. I took 3 steps toward the exit, and then I froze. I was looking at a large armchair that I had covered in plastic the day before. The plastic was draped all the way down to the floor, but the shape of the chair looked uneven. It looked far too bulky on the right side. I stood motionless in the center of the room. I stared at the plastic drop cloth covering the chair. Slowly, the plastic tarp was expanding and contracting. It was rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic motion. Someone was sitting in the chair. They had pulled the heavy plastic drop cloth over themselves, completely concealing their body beneath it. And they were sitting perfectly still in the dead silence of the room, breathing. They were less than 10 feet away from me. If I had put my headphones on that morning and started working, I would have turned my back to that chair for hours. I didn't scream. I simply backed away, step by agonizing step, until my hand found the knob of the front door. I turned it quietly, pulled the door open, and slipped outside. The moment I was out, I sprinted down the driveway. I threw myself into my car, locked the doors, and dialed 911. The police arrived less than 10 minutes later. I gave them the keys and watched from the street as multiple officers entered the house. It took them almost 20 minutes to bring him out. He was a tall, incredibly gaunt man, covered in layers of dirt. He didn't struggle. He just stared straight ahead with a blank, hollow expression as they put him in the back of the cruiser. One of the officers stayed behind to take my statement. He told me that when they found the man, he was still sitting under the plastic tarp in the living room. But the officer looked deeply disturbed as he handed me a plastic evidence bag. He asked if the item inside belonged to me. I looked at the bag. Inside was my missing heavy-duty box cutter. The officer explained that they found it tucked into the front pocket of the man's jacket. The blade was fully extended and locked into place. The police told me the man was a transient who had likely been living in the house for months. He had nowhere else to go, and he was defending what he believed was his territory. I sold the house a few weeks later to a development company. I took a massive financial loss, but I simply did not care. I never went back to finish the job. Because no matter how much money I lost on that property, it was the price I gladly paid to escape the terrifying reality. While I was working alone in that house, playing my music loudly and completely oblivious to the world, a desperate man had been sitting just a few feet away in the same room, holding my own knife and waiting for me to turn my back.